So today we're going to be talking about live streaming and asking whether it's something we should still be doing or thinking about. But we just wanted to mention up front, there's a minor trigger warning. Obviously, we're going to be talking about lockdown. We're going to be referring to COVID when the streaming stuff all really went really big. So if that's something where you're going to feel a little bit triggered by that, that's okay. I still occasionally feel a bit emotional when I watch a video that I know was filmed or uploaded during COVID or something like that. So we thought we'd mention it up front in case you don't fancy listening to this episode, and we won't feel bad at all if you skip this one and come back for the next one. So we'll get on with it.
So, should our churches be live streaming? Often with these episodes where there's a question in the name, you can have a good guess at what our answer will be up front. For example, is church comms worth the time? The answer is always going to be yes. This one maybe not quite so clear cut. It's more of a yes, but, or an ideally, and every church is different, every team is different. And that's why we wanted to have a bit more of a discussion rather than a yes or no answer.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the first thing that we need to define really is what exactly do we mean by live streaming?
Yeah, so when we talk about live streaming, we're talking about on any platform that churches will be on, so likely to be Facebook or YouTube, where most will be live streaming their regular Sunday services or a special occasion such as a funeral or wedding. We're also using the term to cover streams that aren't necessarily available to the public, whether that's by using a private or unlisted stream on YouTube or streaming via Zoom to those who have a link. Both of these are things that many churches are still doing, and we should probably mention that many churches have also been doing these a long time before the pandemic happened.
Yeah, when I first went to my church as a student in Bournemouth, that was probably almost 15 years ago now, and they were streaming back then and still recording the services onto VHS before they then moved to DVD. So definitely some churches have been doing it for a while.
I feel like I want to say, what's VHS? But I do know what it is because I am no longer that as useful as I'd like to think I am. So while some churches have been doing this for a while, let's have a look back at how live streaming became much more popular and much more accepted and encouraged within churches. In a word, lockdown, pandemic, the COVID. Obviously throughout the height of the pandemic, churches were, the doors were shut. They were unable to gather on site. The physical, actual building doors were shut, but that didn't mean that the spiritual church doors were shut. So, many and probably in fact most churches had to scramble to make plans of what they were going to do instead so that they could still do something. Many church leaders effectively continued as normal, kind of with their traditional services, leading it from the front of their church buildings, although they were leading in front of an empty congregate. There wasn't anyone there within the building. They captured it sort of probably with a single camera or smartphone to begin with, and that was fine. It was good. It did the thing we needed to do, and realistically, unless you already had something set up, there was no other option at such short notice. And whilst it wasn't perfect, it allowed churches, it allowed us to connect with the church service, especially at a time when everyone felt very disconnected from each other and probably also, disconnected from God.
Yeah, so streaming in this format definitely filled a need. We were able to continue sharing Bible teaching. We could give out church family news. To some extent, we were able to worship together, or at least to bring people into a place of worship. We can all remember those times of how hard it was trying to have music, especially with some people leaving themselves unmuted. But there was some sense of normality in the way the service was being presented.
Exactly. So, to be able to see your church building when we're all in lockdown, it was a comfort. There was a sense of routine and being familiar to seeing those people or those places. And the basicness and unpolishedness, not to be harsh, there is there is an authenticity to it, and it's endearing and offered that, church leaders are being authentic in what they're doing, which was the best that they could do. They were not tech people. We just wanted to put something out there and reach and connect with people.
Yeah, and I think it was a sense of we're all in it together.
Yeah.
And whether they were in the church building or whether they were doing it from an office at home or something like that, it was authentic.
My minister vicar over the summer months, he did it from his garden shed. I
Hmm.
mean, it wasn't a shed. It was a lovely little thing hut, but it just felt very not natural because we hadn't really seen him there, but it wasn't super polished, and it just felt kind of we were having a conversation with him rather than something super fancy that stressed him out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's rough and ready, but it worked. And
Yeah.
there was other formats as well that people use, and I think this was helpful that I found. So some people had a dedicated online format. So rather than trying to have one person on their own do a full service, they edited something together and they had different people doing different items. Or it might just be that you had interactivity in other senses. So perhaps you had a fairly normal service streamed online, but then other meetings to bring in that interactive element. So that might have been a midweek Bible study or Zoom prayer meeting or home groups, or an interactive coffee time after the main service, as I know some churches did. And these were great because they provided something that a simple piece to camera, rough and ready type service couldn't really do. That is to say, some sense of human contact as we actually spoke to each other and prayed together with others in our church family. You know, in some form that began to meet other needs like accountability and fellowship and sharing, even if it took additional specific effort outside of the main church service.
Yeah. Yeah. However, as things have started to open up again, things became a little bit more complicated. You know, as restrictions on churches were gradually loosened, the format of service was able to grow beyond having just the one person involved. You know, we could have more people taking part with prayers, readings, leading music. More people were able to help with running the service, which may have also made it slightly more feasible to bring in higher production cameras with additional kit or video contribution from others. Obviously, this continued all the way up to returned to, and I say in air quotes, normality for the Sunday service, where everyone was eventually allowed back into the building.
Yeah.
So at this point, you know, what happens to the live stream? You know, with more people in the building, it became harder to justify the same efforts into the online elements. So, you know, many churches who had been really creative and doing awesome stuff, you know, their live stream ended up sort of just being dialed back. And, you know, some churches stopped entirely. Many have continued, but in a style that's much closer to the single camera approach, you know, from the back of the church from the early lockdown streams. And the online experience, essentially, which frustrates me so much, fell into providing an observational view with limited opportunity to engage with those in the building other than watching along. It's essentially just broadcast, not engagement.
Yeah. So at this point, and I think even continuing today as we're a little bit further down the road, we're left with a question of what does it mean to stream online now? What is the point? Should we be investing in it at all? Should we be doing it? Yes or no? You know, should we be providing a better experience for those who are doing church online? Is that even a thing?
Yeah. And, you know, if we are, what can we do so that we're not just doing church online in name only, you know, saying that we're doing it, but in reality just pointing a camera at the front of the church and putting that online with no meaningful engagement? That's not really having an online presence, and that is not stimulating or engaging or enticing to people who might be considering exploring a relationship with your church.
Let's explore that a little bit more then, and just trying to see live streaming from all the different angles that churches need to consider.
Yeah. So first, let's be realistic. The downsides of continuing live streaming. It can sometimes interrupt the weekly habits of churchgoers. And I know that's an argument that many people say. You know, there are friends who used to be at church every week without fail who are not back since COVID. You know, the routines we had of attending on-site church have completely gone. And they probably wouldn't say that they've left the church, but in reality, you know, they have. There are people that tune in each week, in theory, at least, you know, but outside the church, they have no other interaction with the church building, with the church family, and thankfully over time we've seen more people come back, and it's been a very, very gradual process for some people, but there are a lot of people who've also just drifted away. And whilst this is helpful to consider when we think about our live streaming going forward, I think the reality is, on a macro scale at least, given the huge interruption of COVID, this ship has sailed. For those who were going to be shifted from their routines, it's done and dusted. On a micro scale, however, it is worth being aware of it. It can happen that people will occasionally, really not feel like coming out to a service, so they'll watch online instead. And this is the reason for us to keep a watch over our flocks, noticing the trends if people aren't coming along, and, who's in attendance and who's not.
Yeah. This might also then cover those with young children when, for example, one parent stays at home to do the bedtime routine and instead watches online. The reality being they would probably be doing this regardless of whether the stream is there or not. So it's probably more of a benefit to have it there than them just staying home and not having something to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who are only viewing and watching online, they will end up missing out on so much that the on-site church expression can offer. This is the case even with best produced and most thought through creative online experience.
Yeah.
One of the most common arguments against live streaming, sort of full stop, is that people will stop coming to church if they can get it online. And okay, probably there is some truth in this, even if it's a bit oversimplistic. But it's a reality that you cannot get the same experience of church when you're only attending online. And to some, for better, for worse, this may be desirable. It's a lot easier to hide online, and that goes from the understandable end of the spectrum where you want to get a sense of church sort of before attending, all the way through to the other end of where you're completely wanting to avoid accountability or such for the way that you live. But you can quieten the nagging conscience because you're part of the church and you attend regularly, but you're not really there. And this can be helpful for your thinking about live streaming, but I don't think this is a clear cut nor reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So another potential downside is that live streaming adds to the ever increasing workload for volunteers, many of whom are not technically skilled, so often find sort of managing the aspects of church life like this, difficult, and it can be relatively challenging to do any live streaming at all and near impossible to do well. So another potential downside is that live streaming adds to the ever-increasing workload of volunteers, many of whom are not technically skilled, so often find managing aspects of church life like this, quite challenging, and it can be relatively difficult to do any streaming at all, if not near impossible to do it well. And then alongside this, there's a huge potential impact of live streaming on a church budget. Tech costs money to do. So anything beyond a single camera stream, often needs a significant financial consideration.
Yeah. So I think that's enough about the drawbacks. I think there are some reasons that we need to think about potential downsides. But for me, at least, on the whole, live streaming can be a really positive thing. There are some real benefits. So to mention just a couple, there are still many people who can't get out. It's not that they don't want to. It might be that perhaps illness or work occasionally or family commitments mean that they're unable to attend on one or several Sundays. So being able to watch a service is really comforting to them, and it might be that they don't have an alternative, or they'd need to turn to another church that does live stream on those Sundays. It's also a really great way to keep a record of your past teaching, to be able to listen again. Even as a preacher, to be able to listen back, I'm sure is helpful. And especially if people from your church have missed a week or two, they can catch up. That's especially the case if you've got like an ongoing sermon series. I do think it's worth saying, though, that this is becoming more and more a conscious decision that preachers have to make. We're in a skeptical society, and we might not always want everything that we've said from the front in the sermon to be instantly publicly available online. So there are churches who are choosing not to have a complete library of their past preaching online. That's something you have to decide for yourself, and there's certainly ways of doing it so that it's available to your members without being available to the public, if that's something that you're concerned about. And then we also mentioned as another benefit that if you're considering moving to a church or even just visiting a church when you're on holiday, for example, being able to get an idea in advance of the type of atmosphere or the type of service that you'll be walking into can be really helpful. So I think the question is then, if we do want to continue to stream, how do we do it meaningfully? And at the same time, doing that, but without adding a huge amount of extra workload?
Yeah, that's the big question. It might be worth thinking about, but, sometimes bringing the camera closer so that you can actually see the faces of those within the service rather than at the back of the church where you get and sometimes it could be nice to see the back, but also actually being able to see the ministers' faces rather than a small, not that they're small specks, but, not being able to really see who's preaching. That can be quite a kind of helpful way of feeling more involved or sort of closer to those who are directly involved within the service.
And it doesn't cost you anything to do.
No, exactly. Another thing I think is really important is be inclusive with your language. Remember to welcome from the front, but sort of, looking at the camera. And it's a small thing to think about, but can really help people to feel sort of included and acknowledge that they're watching, whilst also reminding those who are attending on site that there are others who can't be in the building, but still require, prayer and community.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And sometimes, and this will depend on the makeup of your church and how many people you've got and that sort of thing, but sometimes you might even be able to show their camera feeds on screen.
Yeah.
It's probably something that I'd want to check in advance with people, but if we know that we've got people who regularly join us online because they can't make it with us, then showing them to the church as they're sitting there can be a helpful, really inclusive thing.
Yeah. I mean, it does require a bit more thought through doing something like that, but I think it can be really powerful as a way of connecting both those on site and online,
because they're already going to be feeling a disconnect by the fact that they can't be there. The likelihood is they want to be there, so anything that we can do to make them feel welcome is going to go a long way.
And then like another big thing, and I've said it already, is that streaming, it has stuff in common with social media. It's not just a channel for broadcast, it's a chance for interaction. And, most streaming platforms have comment sections or a chat box, so make sure that you're interacting and chatting with those who are engaging and watching. You could encourage people to comment back in the chat, or you could write a comment and encourage them to chat back, or you could say, please do let us know where you're watching from, or, things like that. Realistically, as much as you can encourage this to happen somewhat naturally, and it does require having someone whose role is to actively engage with the streams each week. If you're not able to do this, you may have to make this clear, sort of, with a comment, but actually having someone there being able to monitor is great. But equally saying that you're not able to reply in real time, but you'll try to get back to them within the week or something, if they send an email or direct message to your social media accounts.
Yeah, I think giving people those ways to interact beyond just watching and spelling it out for them. If you want people to get in touch, say, here's a link to get in touch with us. Another way that churches do this really well is giving people who are attending online the chance to ask for prayer. Obviously, that relies on you actually following up with prayer, but also with reaching out to the person to tell them that you prayed for them and to ask if they need any extra help as well. Yeah.
Another thing to think about is considering the benefits of making your stream sort of public or private. If it's public, it could be a means of outreach and evangelism and can be a great way to show people what goes on in your church. And you may find that you can justify spending more time and budget on improving the quality of that stream if it is publicly available. But that doesn't mean that you need to go crazy with it. Still keep that authenticity and that realness in what you're doing. But whereas sort of for an internal stream, you'll hopefully, again, quotes kind of hopefully, find people more forgiving. If you're seeking to use your stream to reach those who are within your community, can be just worth a thought of keeping that private. There's other types of meetings, such as, weekly prayers or Bible studies that could happen on Zoom. They are obviously more interactive. And so you don't want that as a stream necessarily. That's a conversation between people. It also means that people can attend when they may not be able to do otherwise. Again, if you've got parents who can't come to a evening Bible study, but actually they could join through Zoom, they're able to attend when they wouldn't have been able to before.
Yeah. So, I mean, to answer the question, should churches be live? Honestly, that's up to you. That's up to your church, your leadership, your strategy, the capacity of your volunteers, but also you need to know the makeup of your church. If you know that there are a good number of people who can't make it, then you probably are going to invest more in an online stream of a church where there's one person. And that's just the reality of the church having limited resources. But then if you're also looking, as Hannah said, to make that an outreach thing as well, then you're going to resource it in a different way. So you need to think not just about what works for you, but what works for the people you want to reach and how do you want to serve them. Sorry, we can't give you a definitive yes or no answer. But what we would say is that if you are going to stream, then do it intentionally, do it strategically, and have a clear vision around it as to why you're doing it. And that will go a long way to helping you know what to do with your stream.
Yeah.
So hopefully, even without that definitive answer, it's been a helpful episode for you to think about your stream. And if you want any specific advice, or if you want to offer any pushback on anything we said, then we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at hello@gppodcast.uk. And as always, if the podcast can be helpful to other people that you know, then do pass it on to them. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.